Although I work a lot with wax-only waxes, there are many people these days who work with resin wax. And this is a wax that contains beeswax and damar resin. Beeswax is normally the refined type, and these are resin crystals from damar, which is another natural tree product. You can mix them yourself in a ratio of 6 to 1, roughly. 6 beeswax to 1 damar resin, roughly. Or you can buy ready-made mediums, and the two big companies are R&F Paint and Encaustic, and I've got some of their colours down here which I'm going to use to make a painting. If you imagine this is the thickness of your wax on the painting, then it's important with resin wax to have a solid support, because otherwise you can easily crack and damage the work. It's very brittle. Rigid surfaces, well, I'm going to just show you two types today. One is what I call MDF board, or masonite I think they call it in America, and this is a sort of 1/4 inch, or it can be thicker, man-made board, and I've just washed over it. First of all sanded it lightly and then washed over it with a primer just to seal it and to make sure that there's a good nice rough surface on it. So it gives plenty of key. Sometimes I cover the board with wax, white wax, and then work onto that. And in the UK, this is called Glass Rock Multiboard, and I bought an 8-foot by 4-foot sheet of it. It's quite big. Basically, it's used for registration at the bottom of a chimney. So it's a heat-proof material, and on one side it's very textured, you can see there, and on the other side it's smooth. It's quite brittle, and it's got sort of fibres inside it, so the fibres hold it all together. And this means that you can put this type of board, or you can heat it as much as you want. Obviously with the wax you shouldn't go over about 93 Celsius. So I'm starting out on this little board, a bit of MDF board, with the Encaustic waxes. This is resin wax pre-mixed with colour, and you can see it's sinking quite well into the surface. There's a lot of key in that board the way I prepared it and showed you. But I realised that in my practice I'd actually put clear wax all over the whole board to start with. And that's a much better idea really, to put clear wax on first, and then the colours sit on top and slide over much more easily. So I made my own task a lot more difficult by forgetting to do that. Anyway, this is a fairly standard landscape for those of you who have done encaustic before, and really the resin colours work very similar to the regular encaustic art blocks that I use a lot. But there are two important things, and I'm going to use this image to show you them. The first one is that you need to work on a rigid surface, and the second one is that you need good ventilation, because the damar resin creates fumes, especially if it gets inside the iron. It creates fumes which aren't very pleasant, and I definitely recommend that you have very good ventilation when you work with resin wax. So I'm going to skip through this quite quickly now and just pick up the important points, and I'm going to use some still shots from the other practice image that I did, as well as live shots from this one. So after I put the first bit on, it got very sticky because I hadn't put the clear on, so I put white on, and I had to keep adding wax to make it liquid enough. Then a bit of darker colour to put in some sort of stone feel, then some greens. And then, this is one of the key points, when you're working on a rigid surface with a rigid tool like the iron, you don't get the peel off effect, so it's a much more blotchy sort of foliage effect. I really had to work to get this colour into the board, and then this sweeping up effect can be very effective on the rigid surface because it creates lots of little rivulets of wax like these ones here, and they can represent the reeds and the grasses that I'm trying to represent very easily. Then it was time to add a bit of darker colour into this foreground and put the posts on, and the long Encaustic blocks were really easy to use for this, just like using the blocks I'm used to. And I enjoy putting the posts in. Just push the iron very slightly across once you've placed it down onto the board. Clean the iron off and then just drag through, and there's enough colour being picked up off the posts and already in the sky area to create these lines. And I'm just using this fence image in a way to show the basics of using resin wax. If you turn the iron round, the back edge is much easier to create blunt-ended lines, which obviously I want, because they have to end on that top wire. And I'm working down actually right through to the board underneath, and you can see the board showing through there and the wax pushed to one side. Then a few details of lighter colour. And to be honest, I actually preferred the original image that I made as my practice one. It had much more contrast, it was much brighter and better, and that's because I used the clear wax on it first. That was the key to remember. Polish as normal, and then it's finished. So rigid surface, good ventilation, key factors. Next up then, painting with brushes. And I've used some little pieces of blue tack to hold the board, stop it sliding all over the place. And then starting off by putting the brush into the molten wax, and this is clear wax, and then using the hot air gun to help in the movement of that wax to make sure that everywhere's covered and that there's a good basis for the rest of the painting. This first layer really needs to bind well into the key that's provided by the board underneath. And you can see the hot plate there with all the waxes on, and if you notice, it's only just hot enough to melt the wax. You can see at the edges that the wax isn't even melted. And you don't want to have resin wax too hot. I've already said the fumes from it, if it gets overheated, and that's about 93 Celsius, really you want it around 80 degrees Celsius. That'll be an ideal holding temperature. Then it'll work easily and you can apply it well. And I use different brushes. I use one just for white, and then I use one for a darker colour. And you can mix straight onto the surface of the hot plate and then make exactly the blend that you want as you go along through your painting. And you can lay the brushes down actually onto that hot plate to keep them warm. So now I'm just gently brushing darker colour to create a basic background shade. This is going to be another landscape, another grass fence, but just in a totally different style. So these colours I actually mixed from dry pigment and waxes that I've made myself. And as I said earlier, the ratio I use is about 6:1. But it's vital that you don't, just cleaning the brush off there, using a piece of tissue, it's vital that you don't overheat the wax, because the resin fumes really aren't good. I don't actually have a fan in my studio area. It's quite a small space that I'm working in. But I have got the through flow of air from 2 external doors, so that seems to be okay for me, but be well ventilated. So toning the colour down a little bit, the blue just makes it a little bit more grey, and this is going to be a sort of a moody sky that I'm creating as a backdrop for my fence. One of the nice things about resin wax and working onto a cold surface with hot wax is that you can really dollop it on. So these marks I'm making are actually quite textural. There's quite a lot of depth here, and that's another reason why it's important to have rigid surface underneath. And then using some darker colour, subtly toning in between those white clouds, using a hot air gun, and I've got it set quite high, and I'm just moving backwards and forwards until I can see that the actual wax does melt, so that the layers that I've put on actually fuse together. And as you do this, there are slight changes. You'll see a darkening of that the darker areas as the heat melts and the wax layers combine, so the darker areas are picking up dark from underneath as well. But it gives a beautiful effect. And then mixing colour. On the palette you can keep on mixing any colour that you like, and I just lay the brushes down on there to keep them warm. And then it's time to put in the horizon line. And I'm always thinking back to that grass fence and the footage that I shot that day way back in January 2012. And changing the colour of the paint. It's very easy, very adaptable. I'm just using the same brush all the time because it's still quite a dark colour. And I'm starting to put in the forms that actually resemble the bunches of rushes and so on that I found up on that plains on the hills. Filling in the area there, and just generally working carefully, all the time mixing colour, building up depth, texture, layers, and by using dark and light colours, it creates the contrasts that give credibility to the image. Because I'm working in layers and I'm actually using opaque colours quite a lot of the time, sort of pastel colours, these actually cover over what was done before, so you hide it. But of course when you fuse it in, some of those can show through again, so you need to bear that in mind as you're working. And then of course it's time to fuse it in again, and this time I'm using a propane butane torch. And if you're using open flame, you need to be really careful and know what you're doing. You need very good ventilation, and you need to make sure you set the flame right. This flame's too big at the moment, so I have to adjust it down. And often when you tip a torch forward, it can suddenly flare. So you need to tip forward and make sure that it's going to hold the right size of flame before you start working. And you can probably see I'm using slow, steady, continuous strokes right the way off the edges, and you can see the wax melting there and changing colour. And underneath I've got a metal sheet, and that means that I can't really do much damage to the surface because it's metal. And I won't be doing this for long anyway. It doesn't take long to fuse it in. Remember to turn it off and put it in a safe place out of the way. And then within moments you can start again, and now it's time to actually put the fence in. I'm just using the actual end of the brush to create these posts, and they're not being done to any plan, just from my memory of what I saw on the film and what I saw that day, which obviously the film brings back into my memory. And then a stylus. Now you can scrape colour up off of the hot plate surface itself into the nib of the stylus, and it will pick it up. But it's easier actually to dip straight into the wells of molten paint, and then you can work much more easily. So again, I'm just putting in representation using the stylus, which is itself heated. And it's all very quick and easy to do. And then in quite a scribbly sort of manner, I'm just putting in, well, representations of the vertical wires. They're not accurate, and that adds to the artistic merit of the piece. It doesn't all have to be photo perfect. And then a few of the grasses themselves. They've given me so much subject material. And of course I have to do a few splodges, so flick some colour out, fill it up. And then same with the brush, just sort of make it a bit more random, a bit more interesting, add some more textures. So shaking the brush off and then cleaning it a little more carefully with a bit of tissue, but not thoroughly, because I can use some of that wax still to add highlights in the foreground, and that just helps to tie in with the white that's in the sky. And then changing brushes, just occurred to me that it needed to sort of be a little bit more bluey green, and so I've picked up a bit of colour to tone it in a little bit more with the foreground. And then as your eye moves around the picture, you may find areas that you think, yeah, I just need to touch that up there. And you can do that with this style of work. So I'm just blocking that end of the fence a little bit with a bit more dark colour. And eventually you'll get to a point where it's all done and dusted and you think, yeah, that's it. So then it's time to fuse that in. And I'm using the hot air gun, but I could equally have used the torch if I'd so chosen. The colours do change slightly as you fuse it together, because as we've seen already, darker colours can come up through. And I felt that that represented very well the fence as I saw it way back in January, and as I filmed it, and I was very happy with all the textures and the interest that I'd been able to capture. And that's one of the things about using this resin wax. It's got a nice hard surface, so it's a bit more friendly to transporting your work around and for galleries and so on. And it's very durable, and you can see the type of colour combinations, textures, all those things on the surface and that come up through the surface, the way the colours fuse and blend, air pockets. And I even painted the back of this just to sort of finish it off. And then when I was photographing it, I dropped it, and so I chipped the corner because it's quite fragile, that masterboard that I used. So resin wax, damar resin, beeswax, is very durable. It's a real good paint to use, and it's worked out well for me here. Things to remember, vitally important, are a rigid surface, good ventilation. It's a lot of fun. When you expose beeswax to a solvent, then it forms a paste. And you can do this cold, or you can do it with the wax molten. Then you have to be much more careful. And once you've got the cold paste, then you can mix oil colours with it, or equally you can mix dry pigments with it. And this is a very different way of working with a cold paste, where you can build up layers, you can create exactly the colour you want as you go along. This is a paste of beeswax and citrus solvent, and oil colour is the colourant that I've used. And you can see, if I rub it with my finger here, how very soft and easy it is to manage. So I got together the things I needed: a little butane torch, the wax solvent paste, oil colours, some palette knives and tools, and 6mm MDF board. That's what I'm actually going to be working on. I cut that to the Fibonacci shape, which is the thumbnail that I'd drawn, and then prepared it by sanding it and then applying a light primer. And this resulted in a beautiful surface that gave plenty of key to the initial application of the clear wax. And this is put on with an 1.5" wide filler knife, which is the one that I was using. The initial coating of wax is left overnight to dry off a bit and then fused in, so you've got a good base to work on. And then next day you can begin with the colours. And you really don't need much colour to influence the wax, but it must be very well mixed. So take time to mix, because this is really important. And then you get nice even tones, and that wax is ready to work and to put on to the board. So still using the same 1.5" filler knife, I spread that onto the board. This is my very first attempt, so it wasn't perfectly even, but that doesn't matter. And if you clean the tools off straight away, you can just wipe them. But if you let them dry out, then you have to scrape them a bit harder. You can use solvents as well. And then fusing. This flame is a little bit too wild, but you can see how it melts the wax and fuses the colour into the board. So I then marked the board out in the shapes that I wanted, that Fibonacci shape, and then I mixed up some white wax and coloured in the first section of that, again using my little filler knife. So I carried on and mixed up some light yellow wax and put this into another section, which is where the grasses are going to go. And I had a bit too much mixed up, which happened quite often to me, so then I put some brown and toned it down, and then I put out a band of brown and a band of yellow, and I could cut across them and mix up a lighter tone of that colour. And I used that on the knife to fill in the long area. So you can always recolour and continue to colour wax when you overmix it. I found I did that quite often. And then I found that I had a little bit of problem on the overlap area, so it was time to tidy that up. I used a small blade to scrape the wax off, and because it hadn't been fused yet, it came off very easily. Now it was time to fuse it, and my butane propane torch was just too wild. I didn't really know how to use it properly, and this flame is too big, and it blew itself out. So I then went on to use a hot air gun, an electric paint stripper, and that worked quite well, quite adequate for the job. And I also tried using a Bunsen burner, which has got a softer flame to it, but that flame isn't so controllable as the torch, so the torch was really the ideal. Then it was time to get on with spreading darker colour and toning that long strip so that there's a sort of a lighter area towards what's going to be the top and a darker tone towards the bottom, which is sort of representing the transition from light to dark, sky to earth. Now that I've got the coating of white fused on top of the original green, I can use that tool, my scribing tool, to scratch through the wax and to actually remove the top layer. And it was really quite easy to take that layer off. You can see here that it goes fairly easily back to the layer underneath. So just carefully scraping it off, because what I want to do is to inlay this with a different colour, but I want the end surface to be at the same level. Now mixing up the paste, so taking some dark colour and mixing it into a lighter tone. Remember, mixing well is really a key thing, and I'm just grabbing a little bit more of the darker colour until I get the tone that I want. And then I can load up the knife, or I can use other tools. And on this occasion I'm using a scrapey tool, which is a silicone tipped tool for moving wax around. And it was ideal for squashing the wax into this channel. So I just worked across the image, filling the 3 channels with wax in this manner. And using the cold paste allows this ease of working in layers, cleaning the tools off, and then I'm scraping with the flat edge just to remove excess, and then working again with very fine lines, just inscribing some detail. And there's a big difference when you're working with a cold wax paste compared to a hot wax or hot tools. When you use hot tools, then they tend to melt into what's already there, whereas the cold wax paste allows you to build up as many layers as you want. And then again, picking up with the scrapey tool and pushing colour into those etched lines that I've now made to represent my fence wire, and again using the flat edge to clean off. And I found fingertips a great asset. And this bit's coming on quite well. Time to look at the yellow section above, which is where the grasses are going to go. And what I want to do is to bring some lighter colour in and try and make tones of grasses to remind myself of those sort of macro shots that I took on the film, when you're actually with the grass stems sort of down amongst their roots and seeing the light up through them. So I thought I'd put some green on here and then, depending on how that worked out, etch back through it. So that's what I did. I used the bladed end of my adapted 6-inch nail, and again it was quite easy to inscribe these lines. You just need a firm, steady hand, and the shavings of wax came off quite easily, leaving channels ready to be filled. So once they were all dug out, I just mixed up some colour and then started to apply it. And I found it really quite important to sort of squash it in from every direction so that the channels were properly filled and there was good adhesion against both edges as well as the bottom. So here I thought, well, I'll make this lower part darker, and then I can add a little bit more oil colour and adapt the colour of the upper wax so that the tops of those channels would take on a lighter colour. And although it's very economical to use, I found that sometimes adding more of the solvent paste, the beeswax solvent paste, to extend the medium was the best way, because you don't want too much oil colour actually in the paste. So I've mixed up a lighter colour here, and I say it again, mixing is vitally important. Make sure you mix the colours really well before you apply them. And then pushing them in as best as I could, going from this direction, that direction, turning the board round, whatever was necessary to make sure that those waxes had really sort of stuffed the channels full, so that after they'd dried off and I burnt them in, there'd be a reasonably even surface. And as I went along, I took photographs all the time. When I initially created the design, I wanted to have divisions, and I've already done the dark one between the smaller and larger area on one side. So now I've etched out the channel and I'm filling it up with white wax on this side, so the long panel is separated. And then I found a bit of packing tape, the banding that you get around parcels just happened to be the perfect thing, the perfect size. And then after I'd scraped that off, I used my finger and finally a piece of cloth around my finger to clean up the sort of smudged wax that I didn't want. Again, stroking with fingertips is really a great thing. And now I've controlled a different heat gun, and so this torch is just burning all of that in. It's already been drying overnight, so I've allowed the solvent to dry off a bit, burnt it in, fused it in nicely, and then polish it first with the tissue and then with the palm of my hand, and again finally with those fingertips. And it came up to an absolutely beautiful sheen, and that's one of the things that I love about this citrus wax paste. Maybe it's the oil in it, I'm not sure. So here was the divisional line, all now correct and fused in. You can see how it's all melded and blended as it fused. And you can also see the darker one I did before. And these are the grasses that are sitting even and level with the surrounding wax that I etched into. And even those very skinny thin lines that I did with the point of the nail and then filled with the scrapey tool, all of that now become one piece of wax, one piece of work. So wax paste can be a beautiful material to use. It is an encaustic process, as was the resin wax that we saw earlier on, and the wax-only waxes that I normally use, the Encaustic Art brand. Each have their own quality, each bring their own opportunity. One isn't really better than another, they're just different. And that's one of the beauties about encaustic, that there are so many variations, so many possibilities, so many opportunities and potentials just in this one medium. So if the wax solvent paste interests you, you could look around masterpasteoriginal.com, see what's there. And if it's the resin wax that you're interested in, then try encausticos.com. They've got loads of stuff there. Or you can search for recipes on encaustic.com in the fine art section if you're interested in making your own products. And so this is me, Michael Bossum, from my Grass Fence episode 5, saying goodbye and saying thanks very much for being with me. Much appreciated. Thanks for your time. Bye bye.